Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, dear listeners, welcome back to the podcast. Before we get into this episode, I wanted to share that, as it often happens, this podcast was originally meant to be a single episode, but then by the end of it, I realized I'd been talking for almost an hour, so I decided to split it into two parts. In this first segment, I'm going to cover how I approached my training in order to prepare for top surgery. And this is going to be a practical example of how to design a specialization cycle in which you prioritize the growth of certain muscles over others. In the second segment, I'm going to cover my top surgery nutrition plan, which will be a good practical example of how to approach a nutrition plan for a meaningful event, be it a major surgery, like in my case, or a wedding, or a holiday that's important to you. At the end of the second segment next week, you'll hear me talk about the podcast going on a potential hiatus. Now, you will be happy to know that that's unlikely to happen, because by splitting this podcast into two and having another one lined up to come out afterwards, I should have plenty of time to create more valuable content to you, despite going on medical leave after surgery. And with that, let's get straight into the episode. Yo, dear listeners, welcome back to the podcast. I'm currently 9 days out from top surgery. So I thought, what better time than to record a top surgery prep one-on-one episode? I actually already covered this gender-affirming procedure in an interview with gender-affirming surgeon Ioannis Stanos, and that was episode 35, and you'll find a link to that in the show notes. After recording that episode, I also wrote an article titled A Comprehensive Guide to Getting Fit for Top Surgery, and again, the link will be in the show notes. However, this episode is different because I want to talk you through my own top surgery fitness prep. I want to discuss my approach to both training and nutrition. Importantly, this is my top surgery fitness prep, so the point of this episode isn't to suggest that you should replicate it exactly, because you are not me. What I want to do is use myself as a practical example to explain how to apply certain principles of hypertrophy training and nutrition for physique development, which I'm going to cover throughout the episode. So what I'd like you to take away are the principles, not necessarily the application, because we can apply the principles in many different ways to suit different physiques, different lifestyles, health statuses, needs, and preferences. But I think it's a lot easier to understand principles if you also have an example, which is what I'm going to provide here. I want to start with training because it's the primary tool for muscle growth, which is crucial if your top surgery goal, like my own, is to have a chest that's as close as possible to what your chest might have looked like had you been born a cisgender man. Now, my training has always technically been oriented towards top surgery because I've known that I wanted this procedure since 2018, when I first found out that it even existed. And in 2018 was also when I started bodybuilding. So I always trained with a goal of building up my upper body as much as possible for the procedure. However, it was since getting my top surgery referral in January 2023 last year that I've been prioritizing pec growth more than ever. I've been effectively arranging my entire program around the growth of this particular muscle group. In general, to my knowledge, surgeons are keen on two muscle groups in particular: the pecs and the latissimus dorsi, also known as the lats. The lats run from your upper arm, down your armpit, all the way down to your hips. And that's one attachment point, but they also fan out from your spine. So they cover pretty much your entire mid and lower back. They are massive. These are the two muscles that my own surgeon examined when I went for my in-person consultation, and they're the two muscles that you want to definitely make sure you are prioritizing in your training. Personally, I already had a pretty well-developed back because I focused on my back a lot between 2020 and 2022, because I felt that I didn't quite know how to connect with my back as I could other muscles, and I really wanted to develop that mind-muscle connection as well as the muscle itself. So in my top surgery prep from January 2023, I was more keen on developing my pecs at the fastest rate possible, and I was pretty content with my back continuing to grow at the rate that it already was growing. Therefore, what I did was create what's called a specialization cycle for my pecs. And these are the resistance training variables that I manipulated in order to design this specialization cycle geared towards prioritizing pec growth. The first variable was my weekly set volume, or the number of sets per muscle group, and in this particular case for the pecs, that I've been doing every week. According to research, there seems to be a dose-response relationship between volume and hypertrophy, or muscle growth, whereby the more volume you do, can recover from, and progress with, the more you're going to grow. So you want to train your priority muscles with as much volume as they can handle productively. And during a specialization cycle, you typically allocate more volume than usual to these priority muscles. Now, if you are just starting out your specialization cycle, I'd suggest that you only add 1 or 2 sets, or 10 to 20% to the volume you were doing previously, instead of all of a sudden increasing by 50% or more. You can continue to increase volume even beyond this initial 10 to 20%, but I wouldn't make a massive jump. You want to build up to the total volume you want to do gradually by increasing probably 10 to 20%, not necessarily every single week, but every time you feel you've adapted to that volume. And what I mean by that is that when you increase the amount of volume that you do, or the intensity, you're likely going to experience a little bit more soreness. And then as you adapt, that soreness decreases. Now, it could happen that you increase by 2 sets, and the next week you don't feel any particular soreness compared to usual, so you just keep increasing. Or it might happen that actually there's quite a considerable amount of soreness, whereby it might even be affecting your performance negatively. And if that's the case, you want to wait until that abates before you make another volume jump. In other words, a gradual increase in volume tends to give your body a better chance to adapt to the new stimulus, avoiding excessive muscle damage, which again means your performance is impacted negatively, and lowering injury risk. Now, I only prioritized my pecs, but you could prioritize more than one muscle in the same specialization cycle. However, you have to consider 2 important limitations. Number 1 is time, and number 2 is recovery. With regards to time, the problem is pretty self-explanatory. If you try to prioritize too many muscles in the same specialization cycle, you end up adding too many sets to your program, and then you fail to complete all of your sessions. With regards to recovery, if you're doing a total number of sets across all of the body parts that you're training that you cannot recover from, then you'll notice that your progress slows, stalls, or in the worst case scenario, goes backwards. So as a rule of thumb, I'd suggest prioritizing maybe 2 muscle groups at most at any one time, which is perfect because I've just suggested to develop your lats and your pecs. An additional consideration is that the specific muscle you choose for a specialization cycle can also impact how many you can successfully prioritize at once. For instance, it's a lot easier to recover from increasing volume in biceps or lateral delts training as opposed to hamstrings or quads. So if you're prioritizing more than one muscle, you'd likely benefit from finding the right combination of muscles that works for you. And let's say that you're not making much progress trying to prioritize both pecs and lats, then I would run a specialization cycle for one and then another specialization cycle for the other at a later stage. The second training variable that you can manipulate to specialize in a certain muscle is your session order, whereby the first session in your training week is the one you have the most energy for. So you want to make sure that it definitely involves training at least one of your current priority muscles. The third variable is exercise order. By the same token as session order, you'll typically experience your best performance doing the first 1 or 2 exercises in each workout, because the more sets you do, the more fatigue you're going to accumulate, the more you see a decrease in performance. This makes intuitive sense. So you want to train your priority muscles at the beginning of a session whenever possible. And I say whenever possible because there are some exercises where I make exceptions. For example, if I were to perform a very technical exercise using a very heavy load, like a deadlift variation, I may still choose to do it first out of safety concerns, even though my hamstrings and glutes and lower back might not be priorities for me at the time. Now, in my particular case, I chose a bad example because I'm really good at hip hinging. So I don't normally or always program my deadlifts first because I can do them really well. But when I have a client who's less experienced with deadlifting and hip hinging in general, then I would typically place it first, maybe second after a hamstring curl if I'm using a pre-exhaust technique. The fourth training variable that you can manipulate is your exercise selection, where you want to pick exercises with a high stimulus to fatigue ratio, or SFR. This is a concept that was first coined by Dr. Mike Israetel from Renaissance Periodization. And my understanding of it is that each exercise produces a certain amount of hypertrophic stimulus, so muscle building stimulus, for your target muscle. It also produces a certain amount of fatigue for both that muscle in particular and for the whole body in general. And the ratio between the amount of stimulus that you get and the amount of fatigue that you incur varies depending on the lift and on the individual. So for some people, the barbell back squat might be an excellent exercise to develop their quads, and maybe they don't get very much fatigue. But for me, for example, that very exercise beats up my entire body, takes me a while to recover, and it doesn't give me as good of a quad stimulus as the pendulum squat does. And the pendulum also happens to fatigue me a lot less, so I can perform and recover from more sets, which will likely lead to more hypertrophy over time. So for me, specifically, the pendulum squat is a better choice than the barbell back squat based on their respective SFRs. And ideally, for your priority muscles in a specialization cycles, you want to pick exercises that provide you with the best SFR possible most of the time. It's not that you can't use exercises with a lower SFR, but at least for the duration of the specialization cycle, I would focus on greater SFRs for the priority muscles. The fifth and final resistance training variable that we can manipulate in a specialization cycle is your intensity of effort or your proximity to failure. And if you want to grow as much muscle as possible, we want to train very close to failure on all of our exercises, even those that we're not necessarily specializing in this particular phase of the training program. And based on the research that I'm aware of, for compound lifts and exercises done in the 5 to 10 rep range, you can likely maximize growth by hitting a minimum of RPE 7 or 3 reps from failure, all the way to straight up muscular failure. Whereas for isolation lifts, and exercise is done for about 10 to 15 reps, I would go for a slightly higher RPE, starting from RPE 8 or 2 reps from failure, all the way to muscular failure as a range. And finally, if you're doing 15 reps or more on an exercise, research seems to suggest that it's best to take these high rep, low weight sets all the way to failure. Again, this applies to all sets regardless of whether a muscle is a priority or not. However, in a specialization cycle, I would consider training your priority muscles closer to failure than you normally would, or closer to failure than your other muscles, especially if you don't take every set in your program to failure all the time, because you can't recover from it. Then make sure to select your priority muscle sets as the sets that you do take to failure if on all the others you hold back a little. So taking these all together, this is how I have been personally applying the principles discussed so far to my own pec training in the last 19 months, give or take, from top surgery referral in January 2023 to my upcoming surgery. First of all, I've been doing more volume for my pecs than for the vast majority of my other muscles, performing between 17 and 21 sets per week. Second, I start my train week with a session that targets the pecs alongside other muscles. And I have 2 total sessions where I target my pecs out of the 5 that I perform every week. Third, I perform all of my pecs focused lifts at the beginning of my 2 pecs focused sessions. Now, I'm not going to talk you through all of my exercises, but some of the exercises for the pecs that give me the best SFR, the best stimulus to fatigue ratio, which have therefore stayed in my program the entire time, include seated cable flies, dumbbell presses, and also cable presses. Although admittedly I haven't kept the cable presses in the entire time, I've been performing them for the last couple of months. And last but not least, I've been taking every single set of all of my chest exercises to failure, except for when I was performing barbell and Smith machine presses, purely due to safety concerns. And this again is very specific to me. I find that I can train a lot of muscle groups to failure and recover well from that. And the pecs are definitely one muscle group where I don't struggle with hitting failure on every set at all. My performance continues to increase at a rate that makes sense relative to how trained I am. So that wraps up the training part of the conversation, and that's the end of part 1. As always, you'll find the links to connect with me and to sign up for coaching in the show notes, and I will talk to you next time. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.